So the first thing we're going to need to do is get our wire hanger ready. And so we're going to have, basically first we want to get the hook part off. It's not a bad idea to keep this because we can always straighten this out, unwind that, and use that for just some decorative or just something to hold something on your automata. So never a bad idea. And then before we get into any of the advanced bending, we're going to need to take this and start straightening it out. And one of the things you always want to make sure of is that when you bend, you always want to put your pliers right near the edge of the metal that you want to straighten out, and then really support it well with your thumb, because you're going to be mostly doing a twisting action to straighten out your wire. And you want to kind of work from one end to the next. So if your hand strength is good, which thankfully mine is, I can usually kind of just take that, and you always want to consider where and how you're bending your wire. Now, something really important about metal is as you begin to bend metal, you want to understand that you need to bend it nice and slow. First off, for safety reasons, because you don't want to, bend something so fast that it spins or it smacks you in the eye. The second thing is just the actual nature of the actual material. Metals, believe it or not, when you get really close up to them, are crystals. And crystals of any sort, if you hit them hard enough, they're just going to shatter. And so when you bend metal, you're building heat. If you've ever taken a paper clip and bent it back and forth over and over again, eventually the metal gets very hot and it just breaks. So when you're doing this kind of straightening, it's always important to just take your time and kind of get things nice and straight, but bend them slowly enough that you don't put so much heat in it that it makes the metal brittle. Now, once you get one whole side nice and straight, you can then kind of choose how you want to do this side. But once we get this straight, we are ready for our next part. So just with a little more work with our pliers, doing a nice twisting action, always holding it nice and straight. And the nice thing is you can also even take the cover off of this. So once we get this all straightened out, ready for our next step. So for our next planning part, I want to kind of talk you through some of the basic measurements. Now, this is just for this particular type of bending, but understand that you can adjust these distances to fit whatever needs you have. So if we're talking about a handle, just this handle, it is basically kind of, if you think about it, it's just going to look like this. Now, the way it's going to break down is this right here is 2 inches. This right here is 2 inches. And so that's going to get you a basic crank handle. So that's all we had to do is measure in 2 inches. So taking my ruler from the end of the metal, make a mark, put a bend. Then I go this way. Once I have that first bend in, I need to think about how I'm going to line it up, but there's another 2-inch distance. And then when we come to this part, before we get to our actual part that's going to do the cranking, this distance, when I did this one for the model I was going to build, it's right around 5 inches, maybe just a hair shorter than that. So this distance really is how far do you need it to go into your chassis. So if you're talking about a chassis like this, that 5-inch distance probably isn't going to do a very good job. Not unless I've got a whole lot of the handle sticking out the side of the box, because oftentimes when you're going to put this kind of a piece in, you're going to want it to be relatively in the center of the box. So this wasn't necessarily a good idea, at least for this distance, for this particular chassis. Now, let's say I had a slightly wider chassis. Well, in this case, this one wouldn't be too bad. So this was actually, the chassis that I built this for was just to come out somewhere about the middle. And I've got a little bit of movement there where I can fine tune it however I want. So back to our idea, I've got my handle. That's 2 inches, 2 inches. But then how do I go about putting in this bend? Well, if I'm thinking about my handle, this is 2 inches. This is 2 inches. Now, when it comes to the bend, this is a 1 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch square, or kind of rectangle, really. So I'm gonna need to go up 1 inch. I'm gonna go over 1/2 inch, and then back down another inch. So that's how I'm going to plan it out. So that is what gets us to our basic bend. Now, here's a couple of tips before we talk about multiple bends. The first thing is when you bend these, it really is worth your time to mark things out. Now, the good news for this 1/2 inch piece is, by and large, when you're talking about pliers, whether it is a standard set of needle nose or some blunt nose pliers, honestly, when you're talking about that 1/2 inch, it almost always tends to be exactly the width of the jaw. So once you've got that 1 inch there, all you really have to do is kind of bend it one way, bend it the other way, and you'll pretty much have your rectangle there. So you can see that when I did mark it with my marker, but really the width of it, you could do this. Now, let's say you had an automata where you need a little thinner. That's where the advantage of the needle nose come in, because since you've got that narrower profile, you don't have to have a gap quite this wide. So in our next section, we will handle how to take something like this, our basic wire crank, and how do we then turn it into this, a much more advanced type of thing. Now, believe it or not, there is very little difference between this and this. The only difference is I had to plan a bit more as I worked my way down the wire. So that'll be our next part. All right, guys. So here is the question of the video. How in the world do we get to this? Well, believe it or not, it is a very simple pattern that once you get started, you can repeat over and over and over again. And as long as you're just kind of thinking ahead and careful, it really just, the wire ends up bending itself. So I'm not going to worry about the crank because we already said that's 2 inches by 2 inches, but let's talk about this. Now, when we're talking about a piece of wire where we're doing this type of a crankshaft, where it's going to get that really neat kind of wavy motion, what I want you to think about is this is just this repeated in 3 dimensions. So you're going to need to think about, not only do you need to keep your wire flat this way, but you also need to consider that when you look down it, it will look a bit like a plus sign. So this just becomes, I'm making this bend, and then when I'm ready to make my next one, I'm just going to change the direction by 90 degrees. Now, this may seem easier to say than to do, but again, if you think about your wire and you plan it out, this wire will almost seem to bend itself. So let's talk about the pattern. The pattern that we're going to use on this, and again, we're skipping over the handle. We're just going to talk about this wire bending section right here where we're putting all of our cranks in. What the pattern is, wait for it, you might get shocked. It's going to be 1 inch, then 1/2 inch, and then 1 inch, and then 1/2 inch, and then 1 inch, and I think you get the idea. It is literally a repeating pattern of 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, all the way through. If you don't believe me, check this out. When I make my first bend, it's a 1 inch, then a 1/2 inch, then a 1 inch, then a 1/2 inch, then a 1 inch and a 1/2 inch, 1/2, 1 half, 1 half, and so forth. So all of this is marking out your distances and then bending. So let's mark up a piece of wire and bend it for ourselves. All right, guys, so we're gonna start from one end of the wire and work our way down. So we're gonna mark in our handle first. So that's gonna be a mark at 2 inches right there and a mark at 4 inches right there, because that's gonna make our handle piece. And then we'll worry about putting in our cranks. Now, little tip I wanna show you when looking to bend the wire. When you mark your material, you're gonna wanna pick which side of the line you're gonna wanna place your pliers. Reason being is if I put my pliers on this side of the mark to bend it one time, and then on the next piece I put it on the other side, I'm gonna create little inconsistencies that are gonna make certain areas of the wire wider or narrower than the other, rather than having a nice consistent thing. Now, because I'm working with you guys here and you're watching me online, I'm gonna go ahead and choose to pick to be above the line every time. And what I wanna think about is I wanna turn my hand as I put a little bit of downward pressure on the wire with my thumb. Now, let's say that's a tough thing to do. Well, if you want, one of the other cool things you can do is you can always grasp, if you kind of mark the wire here, and you get because again, I'm gonna go right above the mark. So I'm thinking of always working from this end of the wire, and I'm always gonna work down my material. So I'm always gonna put this above the line, is I can actually push this against the table and roll it against the table. So in this case, I've got enough hand strength where I can bend this. Now, when we do this, there's two kind of ways I gotta really think about how to bend this. Now, of course, I've got to put my 90-degree bends in here to get my handle. But I also need to think about how straight this is this way. Now, if you look at it, I did okay on this bend, but I've already got my handle tracking off to one side a little bit. So while you're doing this, you always want to take a second and lay this on the table and what you're working with and see if it's actually laying flat, which in this case, it's really not. It's actually standing up, just a little bit. So it is worth the time. And you can see if I hold it this way, you can see it's kind of jogging off. You just want to put a little, just always keep it straight. Well, while you work with wire, if you take the time, the little bit of time while you're bending it, it will save you a lot of time when trying to repair your wire later in the build. And so this is really just a matter of the little bits of fixes that you do along the way. If you don't fix them now, they're going to multiply and they're going to get worse. But if you just fix little things as you go, you'll find that you tend to have fewer errors as you go along with bending your wire. So now that we've got our handle, let's talk about how we're going to start putting in our bends. All right, guys, for our next step, before we start putting our bends in, we need to do a little planning with our chassis. Now, for the example I'm going to use, I'm using a box that's 9 inches long. And what I want to think about is when I'm putting my wire crankshaft in here, where do I really want the bends to start? What am I eventually planning to put on the top of my automata that I'm going to be powering with this piece of wire? So maybe it's only going to be something here in the middle. Well, I might pick, 4.5 inches, 5 or so, depending on what I'm planning. But let's say I have something where maybe it's like that droplet of water thing, or maybe it's a moving caterpillar, an inchworm, something where I'm going to want to put a lot of bends in. I'm going to first think about where my crank is going to come in contact with this side of the box. Remember, we're always working from one end of the material all the way through to the end. So I want to physically mark that before I do any other planning, because if any other planning and then all of a sudden this thing ends up over there, it could cause trouble. And what's worse, I could run out of wire. It may seem like right now, wow, I got this big old long piece of wire, but you run out of wire pretty quick when you're putting in effectively, 2 inches of bend for each little part that you're going to kind of attach to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm not going to go crazy. For those of you who are like, but Mr. McDonald, be super precise. Okay, I'm going to put this right here and I'm going to mark it 1/2 of an inch right there. Now, here's another cool little tip. If you notice, and it might be hard to see, let me see if I can zoom in here. If you notice, I'm using a metal ruler, and this metal ruler is pretty square. And you'll notice, hey, I fixed the bend up here, but look at this. This one's kind of leaning out here. This is a neat little tool. If you take a straight edge, and it's got a nice 90 degree at the end of it, I can realize, ooh, okay, I need to fix that. So that gives me another opportunity just to put a little bend and get that nice and straight. So now when I put it up against my ruler, oh look, it's much, much straighter. I'm getting a much straighter bend. And again, the little inconsistencies here can lead to challenges later. So now that I've got my mark set up here for the end of the box, let's think about where I want to start my bends. So I'm going to just plan, for the fun of it, that this thing is really going to go, pretty far, across. So I'm gonna want a lot of bends, and considering each one is about a ½ inch, I want to fill this thing up. So I'm going to start at 1½ inches in, or if you think about it, I'm just going to go ahead and move this to this line, because you always want to think where you are starting from. I'm going to want to start right here. I'm going to give myself an inch. So this will be sitting here, and then this is where my first bend is going to start. That's going to give me a lot of room to do up here. Now, once I've got that kind of set, because this is where my bends are going to start, now I can start marking this for our awesome little pattern here. So remember, for the bending pattern, it is 1 inch, a ½ inch, 1 inch, a ½ inch. And so all I have to do is just kind of mark, well, okay, here's an inch. And if I think about this, I can just go, okay, here's a ½ inch. And then here's 1 inch. Now, for those of you maybe who are struggling a little bit, or maybe measurement is still kind of a newer deal, you can literally go, here's 1 inch. Move your material. There's a ½ inch. Then slide your material. There's 1 inch. Go back here. Here's a ½ inch. Slide it over a little bit. Here's 1 inch. Slide it a little over more. So kind of keep it always go there. So here's my 1 inch. If I ever forget, there's my pattern. So here's a ½ inch. Here's 1 inch. A ½ inch. And so you can mark on this piece of material as far as you want, as many bends as you want, well, at least as many bends as you have material for. Now, each one of these is going to be a piece that's going to kind of stick out in a certain direction. So each one of these 1 inch segments is going to be one of these. So this is 1 segment, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if I wanted a unit that looked like this, I would need 6 of these little sets. So think of this as kind of one kind of unit. So it'll be this. So I've got 3 inches, 2 right here, plus the 2 halves. So 1 3-inch segment is going to get me one of these, because this is a 1 inch, ½ inch, 1 inch, half. And then I'll go again, 1 inch, half, 1 inch, half. And then here's my next one, 1 inch, half, 1 inch, half. So if you wanted to be one of those really precise folks and you wanted to plan out, okay, do I have enough wire? Basically, you need 3 inches per segment, per little thing here. So go ahead and mark out as many as you want, and then let's talk about how we're going to bend this up and make this thing now 3-dimensional. All right, guys, so now let's get to the bending. Now, before you start just going off on all bending and everything, let's remember what we marked in. This first mark right here is where our crank is going to cross the wall of the chassis. And this distance right here is that little bit of room I'm going to give before I start bending. Now, reason why I bring this up is I've even done this myself, is I will start bending on the wrong mark and then it sets off, kind of a weird rhythm in my pattern, or my pattern doesn't work anymore. So it's never a bad idea to just kind of stop, reorient yourself, and remember, okay, this is where I'm going to start my bending. Now for me, I honestly just prefer starting my first bend and making it on the same plane, or what we would say parallel to my handle. It's just, you could make it really honestly go in whatever direction you want. But for me, this is a really good way to kind of start a pattern off easy. So I'm going to go to my second mark here. This is where I'm going to start it. And just like we said, I'm always going to go just above the mark right here. But what I want to think about is when I grab this, I need to think about how my pliers are oriented against my handle. So although I'm grabbing it here, I may not necessarily want to bend the wire kind of up the way I've got it. I need to turn this wire, because we need to start thinking about this piece of material in 3 dimensions. So my first bend, still going to grab it just above the mark with my pliers like we were doing over here. And so I'm going to bend this first. Again, taking the time to make sure it's flat. So if I notice one corner is up, if I kind of zoom in there, you'll see I've got a little bit of space. I can actually take my little pattern here and you'll notice it just goes right underneath that. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix it right now. Just do a little bit of adjustment here. So just kind of little fine tune. Once I've got that flat on the table, which if you're ever worried about that and you're holding it, barely any touching, I can't fit paper underneath it. So I think we're pretty good there. So here's my first bend. Now I'm going to want this to come back this way and then come back down, because this is the thing I need to put my hole, because here's my crank. So I always want to keep in mind that this kind of is my axle running through my machine. So again, come on over here. I'm going to grab this just above, because remember, we're working from one end of the material to the other. Just going to take that right there, give it a bend. And with each bend, you want to go through and just double check for that flatness, keeping it nice. So now that I've got that there, grasp my material right here. And again, you could see that 1/2 inch is just about the width of the jaws on my pliers. So it's pretty nice. So now that I've got this, good firm grip, bend it back down. Almost there. So here's 1 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this, and one of the things you always want to eyeball when you're grabbing your material is, when I bend this wire up, is it still going to be in line with this? So I want to think and just eyeball it. The human eye is pretty accurate. Trust yourself. You can see this, and that's why I always want to grab just above, put my bend in. Now still need to do a little bit of fine tuning. So when I lay it back down, there's my first bend. Now, this is where it gets fun, and you really have to keep your wits about you, but this is where it starts looking cool. When you think about looking at this down the line, remember, I got to have a plus sign. So you have a choice to make. Is your first bend going to go this way, or is it going to go this way? Now, generally speaking, the pattern I kind of think about is I have first go up, then kind of go back, and then go down, and then come back up. So you kind of think of the clock, it would be kind of 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. That's kind of the way I just think about it in my mind. So this is at 12 o'clock. If I'm thinking about, here's my handle, and I'm looking down it. So I'm going to bend this wire towards 3 o'clock going this way. So just like I did, coming back to my material, going to grab just above the marking, as I've been doing with all that. And remember, this now is going to come up towards kind of the 3 o'clock. So as I bend this, I'm going to bend this up. And now I need to not only make sure this is flat, but that we have set up this where it's at 90 degrees. So this again, little bits of adjustment, but this should be pretty flat, and this should be coming up pretty flat. And if you kind of put it flat on the table, you can kind of just use your eyes and see, is it, going up at a weird angle, back at a weird angle. So you can kind of eyeball it like that. Now that I've got this kind of going in my 3 o'clock direction, I'm just gonna complete the loop. So always orienting where you're working from one end of the material to the end. So grabbing just above the mark as I did, bend this, come around, bend this back. I'm going to look at it this way because I want to make sure that these two pieces of wire are nice and in line with each other. And you can see also I've got this nice 90 degrees here. And then all I'm going to do is I need to come back to my center axle right here. So grabbing here, always above the mark, as I've been doing, give it a bend. And now I've got two bends. Now, I still might have a little bit of work to do here because you can see that this bend up here, it's just slightly tilted up, just a little bit. So I can take my pliers and very carefully just bend things there. When you kind of make these, it seems like you could just whip through it. But with bending wire, it does take a little more finesse, just a little bit of adjustment here and there. And that little adjustment that you make throughout the wire saves you so much time and frustration later. So I can even see maybe this bend is a little shallow. So come back here, put just a teeny bit more of a bend into it. Okay, and that's looking pretty good there. See if I can bend this down just a little bit. I think we're looking pretty good there. So there is our first and our second bend. So coming back to my handle, I got 12 o'clock. I got 3 o'clock. My next one is going to go down for 9 o'clock. So I'm going to find my next mark, which is right here. And just as I've been doing throughout this, I'm always going to think I'm working from the one end of the material through this way. So I'm going to get my material. I'm going to grab it just above the mark, just like I did right here. Maybe even scooch it in a little bit. You can always do those little bits of fine tuning right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and bend this down. So when I'm looking at this, here's my handle. But I kind of went in a little bit like that. That's okay. We can fix that. We can just, a technique you can do is you can always grab the wire with the pliers here and then use the hook to turn it. Gives you a little more leverage that way. So now I can get that pretty well in line. Not too bad. So coming back in here, and with bending wire, there's a lot of flipping around and looking at this from all different angles. The more you flip around and look at it, the more precise and accurate your work becomes. So now here I'm pointing down at 6 o'clock. So here's 3 o'clock, here's 6 o'clock. It's going down. Here's my next thing. So go ahead and grab it just above the mark right there to finish my loop, just like these two. So grab that, roll it up, double checking to see how it's in line. Looks like I bent it offline a little bit this way, so no problem. We can go ahead and we can fix that. So take my pliers, see if I can just kind of bend that a little bit. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better in line. Ooh, maybe went a little too far there. Okay, so here's my 6 o'clock bend. Just going to go ahead and grab this next piece just above the mark. Bend it back. I can see I already went a little bit offline. No problem. Kind of get that there, get that straightened back out. And so let's see how we're doing. Got our handle. We got 12 o'clock. We got 3 o'clock. We now have 6 o'clock. And looks like we've been able to maintain pretty straight. I think this one's going down a little bit, so I'll probably go back and see if I can, just bend that up just a teeny little bit to get this all in a nice line, because I want to think that throughout this whole deal, throughout the whole construction, this needs to be maintained, this line. Because otherwise your crankshaft is going to start going in weird directions and, your parts won't be where they need to be. So I can go just do a little fix there, bring that back together there. So it's just a little bit of fine tuning all the way through. So now that I'm here, all I have to do is grasp it just above the mark, bend it back in line, and now I've got my third bend right there. So going back where I'm looking down the end from my crank, I've got my 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock. I'm gonna go ahead and do one more set so I can do my 9 o'clock, and we'll be just about done. So from here, my mark got a little faded, but you'll kind of see the rest of the way through. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you I'm just gonna grab here above the mark, because I need this to go to 9 o'clock now. Because remember, here's 6 o'clock right here, 9 o'clock is going that way. So bend here, take a look at it, make sure it's in line, then grabbing above the mark, bend that down, get that looking like it's 90 degrees, grab above the mark, bring that back as I hit my camera. So here's 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Remembering to grab just above. So whenever you get lost, it's really easy to get lost in a piece of wire like this. Always remember, this is the end you started on. Your crank is basically where up is. So if I'm ever kind of looking at this like, okay, which side of the mark am I going to grab now? Always remember, okay, use your imagination, follow with your eyes. This is the top. So if I'm going to grab this marking, here's my next mark. I'm going to grab just above it so I can continue the pattern. Bring that forward. Get that line back up. And double check. So here we are. Not too bad. So here's my crank. And if I think about it, here's 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. And what I've just done is made one series where it will now fire in order. Now to continue that, all I'm going to do to restart the pattern is I'm here at 9 o'clock. So all I need to do is this next part is going to go up. So it'll be 12 o'clock, and then 3 o'clock, then 6 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock. And so as you repeat the pattern, hopefully you can kind of see that this is just going to continue over and over again. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put it on a little bit of time lapse so that way you can watch, and I'm just, that way you can just kind of enjoy the rest of this. I'm going to finish this out so I will have a whole other set because I've just done 4 here. So I've got enough marked out where I can do another 4 here. Let's take a watch. right, guys, so here we are now with our final product. I've still got a little bit of, just a little bit of minor adjustments to make with this. One thing that you'll find is when you do this, and it's kind of one of the reasons why I said it in the video, is wire on the one hand seems easy to work with, but I will tell you that the more bends you put in a piece of wire, the more little problems, little kind of misalignments start showing up. But I think if if we consider it, all things considered, I have a little bit of Legos over here just off to one side to kind of hold this. But I think if we consider what we built here, I don't think that's too bad. So you can kind of see that we have, if this is our, kind of 12 o'clock, so it's just 12, 3, 6, 9, and then you can kind of see how it makes it a nice functional unit. So I hope this helps. I hope that this guides you and inspires you to add even more cool mechanisms to your automata. I want to thank you so much for watching, and good luck building, and keep rocking that science. Have a great day, guys.